Hello, I'm going to give you a lecture that's going to approach but not quite cover completely the material in chapters 2, 3, and 4, drugs and delinquency, or drugs and alcohol, crime and delinquency, and violence. I'm going to approach it from the standpoint of more general sociological approaches and introduce some sociological theory, which has been introduced in those chapters of your social problems textbook, but I'm not going to take quite the same approach or look at it from the same point of view. So there may be some things which seem to be in conflict with or contradict some of the information you see in the social problems text, which I encourage you to read before the exam. If so, go with what's in your textbook. So basically, I'm going to be talking about the sociology of deviance, deviant behavior. Now, what is deviance? First of all, let me define a norm. A norm is simply a rule that the members of a culture or society have basically agreed to follow. It's important enough that failure to follow it should be at minimum noticed, sometimes discouraged, and in the case of certain norms that are very important, more important than table manners, for instance, or customs, shaking hands, maintaining eye contact when speaking, these norms that are very important, in violation of which it creates a threat to the stability of the society as a whole. Those norms can be written down in a legal code, and these become laws. And violation of those norms that are written down, of the laws, are not only deviance, but they are crimes. So deviance in general, borrowing from Anthony Giddens and some other writers of a textbook I'm quite fond of, deviance is nonconformity to a given set of norms that are accepted by a significant number of people in a community or society. So many of these norms violation is not a crime. It may earn some other kind of sanction. A sanction is simply a consequence that follows from an action. Sanctions can be positive or negative. A positive sanction isn't a reward for doing something. Negative sanction is punishment for doing something. So crimes tend to have negative sanctions as their consequences of some sort, which could be imprisonment, probation, being supervised by an agent of the state, up to and including execution in some states of the U.S. and some countries of the world at the present moment. Texas leads the United States, the other states of the Union, in the number of people it puts to death regularly. If you're interested in capital punishment in Texas, there's a lot of literature about that. A film, which is pretty good, excellent actually, documentary, Into the Abyss, directed by a very prominent documentarian, Werner Herzog, is set in Texas. He visits a person on death row in Huntsville, Texas, where executions are carried out. He talks to the family of the victims of the crime that this person was convicted of and sentenced to death, and gets close to the complexity of the entire issue. It's not a film with a really overt point of view, although there is one, because we're talking about the ethics of the government murdering people, basically. So I'm going to start this presentation that I use in my sociology classes. I've added a few things specifically for this lecture. So I'm going to share my screen. And this should be the one that I'm going to be sharing. And once I get it started, I will know that. All right. Well, I'm going to share a different screen. Just a moment. I need to share that one. Not sure why I'm seeing numbers on that. Okay. All right. Now just give me one moment and we will be back in business. Okay, lecture 10, Deviance and Crime. I often decorate the title slide of a presentation with something that is related to what I'm going to be talking about. So here we have a prison. This is Illinois State Prison in Joliet, Illinois, a very rough place. You see this arrangement. The cells are in a circular pattern, sort of a donut shape. In the middle here is a guard station. The guards can see all of the prisoners at once. They're under observation. This design is based upon an idea of a British philosopher of the 19th century, Jeremy Bentham. It's referred to as the panopticon, pan meaning every, opticon, viewing, a device for viewing everything. This fellow over here is Michel Foucault, very influential theorist in a number of fields right now. He wrote a lot about prison and the notion of a panopticon and extended that into a general theory of society in the book Discipline and Punish. So, and we will come back to him in a moment. We'll come all the way around. So, prison, where one. Charles Manson, a famous, he actually apparently did not actually murder anyone, but if you've seen the film Once Upon a Time in California, in Hollywood, excuse me, which came out recently and won, I think, a Best Actor award for Leonardo DiCaprio, I believe, or a Best Supporting Actor for Brad Pitt. I don't recall which now, in last year's Academy Awards. Manson was the leader of a cult in Southern California that the members of which murdered the famous actress and everyone in the house, as well as people in another house. And Manson had inspired them to do this various ways. He did not take part. Here we have someone who was very prominent in Houston society in the 1990s, Jeffrey Skilling. He was the CFO or the CEO and COO eventually. The COO and eventually the CEO of a company called Enron. You may have heard of that. It was a big deal in Houston in the 90s and the early parts of the year 2000 or the decade of the 2000s. It turned out to be based on a lot of fraud. So white-collar crime is the type of crime committed by people just in the course of doing normal business. Typically, it's a crime quite often of more affluent individuals who have the power and ability and knowledge to hide what they're doing from others. They're not usually small-time thefts we're talking about, so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I include mental illness as a type of deviance. Typically today, I know in our textbook that's covered in the health and medicine chapter, sociologists seem to have surrendered this subject to the medicalization of behavior. My training, I'm old enough that I remember when sociologists were very interested in this. Particularly because there was a period of time when some of the treatments for mental illness were rather severe. In this case, here's a couple of doctors planning to perform a lobotomy. A lobotomy was an operation that was performed on people to make them behave. If there was a time when, and not so long ago, when it was not difficult at all to have a troublesome family member, child, spouse, relative of one sort or another, declared insane by a court of doctors who went before a judge and put away in a mental hospital until the doctors felt they were well enough to be out. It was much like a prison sentence, but with no definite endpoint. So lobotomy was popularized by a particular individual who developed it, and he went around the country teaching it to other doctors, and it was very popular. But this is basically the instrument that's used. And this thing that looks like an ice pick would be inserted beside the eyeball and pushed back into the brain to a specific point, and then it would just be kind of wiggled back and forth, and it would sever the connections between the one half of the brain and the other in the frontal lobe area, the part of the brain which is it's claimed to be connected with judgment and rational thought and so forth. Basically, they made vegetables of people. Sometimes people did not survive this operation, but it continued. It's illegal now. It's not done anymore. There are certain circumstances where something like it is done as a treatment for epilepsy, but it's very rare. Okay, not everything, as I mentioned, not everything that's a crime in one country is a crime in another, and the borderline between deviance and crime, and in fact the borderline between deviant behavior and just regular behavior, varies over time. Here is an example of this indicates this place sells marijuana for medical purposes. There in many states, if you have a license or a certificate from your doctor indicating marijuana could be helpful, you may legally purchase and consume marijuana, which in a few states it's totally legal now. The recreational marijuana is allowed. Las Vegas, California, Washington State, Oregon. Primarily they're western states, but there are several others, and many other states. The penalties have been reduced. When I was growing up in the state of Missouri at that time, if a person provided marijuana to an individual under the age of 18, they could be executed. It was a capital crime. That's no longer the case. I don't know of anyone that was executed during my lifetime in Missouri for that crime. That shows they were pretty serious about it. And if you are a fan of Netflix and AMC channel, you may recognize these two from Breaking Bad. The characters Walter White and Jesse Pinkman, Aaron Paul and Bryan Cranston. What are they up to? They're manufacturing an illegal drug, methamphetamine. So there are no states where methamphetamine is legal. Still quite illegal and dangerous and very bad for the body and mind. What do we have here? This is a bit of sexual deviance. We're not covering that, but it sort of relates back to Dr. Foucault here in a way that I'll lead you to later. So moving on, this is basically the definition I just read, written slightly differently. Primary deviance is the initial act of breaking the rule or the law. Secondary deviance is acceptance that you are a deviant or you're internalizing the deviant identity. This relates to something called labeling theory. There are several important social psychological theories about how people become deviants and criminals as well as a type of deviance. But no action, at least most do not believe now that a particular action is inherently deviant. Now, as I said, murder, for instance, is considered beyond deviance and into the realm of deviance, which needs to be punished. There are laws, obviously, against murder in all societies. And crime, as I already said, is any deviant act that violates the law. It's considered too threatening to society. And that is varied from time to time. We don't burn people who claim to practice witchcraft anymore. Um, However, it used to be quite common. Howard Becker was one of the early theorists of deviance, or one of the most important, wrote a book called Outsiders, Studies in the Sociology of Deviance. So he maintained that it's a matter of power, that deviance is created by powerful social groups and create rules and apply them to people, and the people who have violated these rules are outsiders of a sense, or deviants. And he believed that a deviant is no more than someone to whom the label's been applied. And the degree to which, whether an act's going to be considered deviant or not often depends on who commits it, who feels he's been harmed by it. For instance, an unwed mother, for instance, in Puritan New England could be ostracized, but often if no pregnancy ensued from the behavior they were claiming was a violation of their ethical code, then they tended to look the other way, particularly if it was a powerful person in the community. So a quote from the book here is, differences in the ability to make rules and apply them to other people are essentially power differentials, either legal or extra legal. Those groups whose social position gives them weapons and power are best able to enforce their rules. Someone once told me that the golden rule can also be read as, he who has all the gold makes all the rules. He or she, I should say. Okay, back to Foucault. Foucault was an historian, not a sociologist, but he developed a lot of ideas that have been taken up by social theory, political theory, what is known as cultural theory, a certain number of historians. So he was interested in the connections between knowledge, power, and what he called the government of the body, disciplinary treatment of the body in order to control behavior. In his view, a person, you're born into the world, you're a lump of flesh, you are a body. Your parents give you a name, and you may answer to that name and so forth, and you may have certain characteristics, but you become an individual subject in this modern social sense as a result of the application of techniques of surveillance and surveillance, basically, by institutions, by powerful individuals who have managed to carve out an area of a domain of expertise for themselves, where they are given the right to make judgments about people. For instance, he wrote a book, The Birth of the Clinic, where the idea that someone was a patient of a physician did not always exist. When people became patients, they tended to be seen by the doctors as a cluster of organs, perhaps, and not as a human. The physicians would worry about the balance of the humors between organs, and it was not a holistic approach to medicine. Madness and Civilization, he wrote about how the category of the insane was applied simply to people who were different. But this label that was given them by professionals with the power, the authority to make these divisions of people between the sane and the insane, these people were often segregated from the rest of society. In the Middle Ages, before this, what he called a discourse, which is a group of ideas that basically creates its own subject. The discourse of madness created the category of the mad, of the insane, and empowered those who knew this discourse to make these judgments. So they were just considered different before this discourse came into being, and would tend to be tolerated. It was just an odd person who was different. R.D. Laing wrote an important book back in the 1960s called The Politics of Experience, where he wrote that people that we would now label as schizophrenic, a type of mental illness, might have been considered in some cultures and in earlier times someone who had some insight into the divine world, into another realm. People would go to them for help and suggestions and interpretation of dreams and so forth. So his most important and accessible book, published in '79, Discipline and Punishment, he dealt with how criminals had been treated, how criminals had been created, connected, and you, as you saw from the panopticon, surveillance of the prisoner is a key feature of what goes on in a prison. You also have professionals in there who are creating records about the person. They are interviewing the person. They are gathering information about their background, the crimes they've committed, trying to apply certain techniques of rehabilitation. It might be, that word is still out there. Or simply, in the early days, prisons, by early, I mean, really, you didn't find prisons before, let's say, the year 1000. In most societies, there wasn't a sufficient surplus of food and other resources to punish someone by putting them in a cell and feeding them every day and just waiting till for a length of time. That became more common over time. In the beginning, they were expected to, it was not uncommon, early prisons, you would be in solitary confinement your entire sentence. You might be in the prison, in your cell with a Bible, and you were expected to study the Bible and contemplate your sins so that when you were released, you would not repeat that. But all these activities, the interviews, the analyses, the tests that you might have to take to pigeonhole you into a certain category, these are creating the individual criminal. So, and Foucault sees this more broadly, multiple institutions acting to create the individual subject, someone that can be subject to the discipline of these discursive formations, he called them. I don't want to go too deep into theory here, it's not necessary, but you know, not everyone, historians hate Foucault, maybe not hate him, but he unnerves them because his history is not necessarily accurate, but that did not concern him. If you watch this, in fact, we might as well watch it. I will reorient my microphone here so you can hear it as well as see it.
Michel Foucault was a French 20th century philosopher and historian who spent his career forensically criticizing the power of the modern bourgeois capitalist state, including its police, law courts, prisons, doctors, and psychiatrists. His goal was to work out nothing less than how power worked, and then to change it in the direction of a Marxist anarchist utopia. Though he spent most of his life in libraries and seminar rooms, he was a committedly revolutionary figure. He met with enormous popularity in elite Parisian intellectual circles. Jean-Paul Sartre admired him deeply, and he still maintains a wide following among young people studying at university in the prosperous corners of the world. His background, which he was extremely reluctant ever to talk about and tried to prevent journalists from investigating at all costs, was very privileged. Both his parents were inordinately rich, coming from a long line of successful surgeons in Poitiers in west-central France. His father, Dr. Paul Foucault, came to represent all that Michel would hate about bourgeois France. Michel had a standard upper-class education. He went to elite Jesuit institutions, was an altar boy, and his parents hoped he would become a doctor. But Michel wasn't quite like other boys. He started self-harming and thinking constantly of suicide. At university, he decorated his bedroom with images of torture by Goya. When he was 22, he tried to commit suicide and was forced by his father, against his will, to see France's most famous psychiatrist, Jean Delay, at the Hôpital Sainte-Anne in Paris. The doctor wisely diagnosed that a lot of Michel's distress came from having to keep his homosexuality, and in particular, his interest in extreme sadomasochism, away from censorious society. Gradually, Foucault entered the underground gay scene in France, fell in love with a drug dealer, and then took up with a transvestite. For long periods in his 20s, he went to live abroad in Sweden, Poland, and Germany, where he felt his sexuality would be less constrained. All the while, Foucault was progressing up the French academic ladder. The seismic event of his intellectual life came in the summer of 1953, when Foucault was 27 and on holiday with a lover in Italy. There he came across Nietzsche's book, Untimely Meditations, which contains an essay called On the Uses and Abuses of History for Life. In the essay, Nietzsche argued that academics had poisoned our sense of how history should be read and taught. They made it seem as if one should read history in some sort of a disinterested way in order to learn how it all was in the past. But Nietzsche rejected this with sarcastic fury. There was no point learning about the past for its own sake. The only reason to read and study history is to dig out from the past ideas, concepts, and examples which can help us to lead a better life in our own times. This essay liberated Foucault intellectually, as nothing had till then. Immediately, he changed the direction of his work and decided to become a particular kind of philosophical historian, someone who could look back into the past to help to sort out the urgent issues of his own time. 8 years later, he was ready to publish what's recognized as his first masterpiece, Madness and Civilization. The standard view is that we now treat people with mental illness in so much more of a humane way than we ever did in the past. After all, we put them in hospitals, give them drugs, and get them looked after by people with PhDs. But this was exactly the attitude that Foucault wished to demolish in Madness and Civilization. In the book, he argued that things way back in the Renaissance were actually far better for the mad than they subsequently became. In the Renaissance, the mad were felt to be different rather than crazy. They were thought to possess a kind of wisdom because they demonstrated the limits of reason. They were revered in many circles and were allowed to wander freely. But then, as Foucault's historical researchers showed him, in the mid-17th century, a new attitude was born that relentlessly medicalized and institutionalized mentally ill people. No longer were they allowed to live alongside the so-called sane. They were taken away from their families and locked up in asylums and seen as people one should try to cure rather than tolerate for just being different. You can recognize a very similar underlying philosophy in Foucault's next great book, The Birth of the Clinic. His target here was medicine more broadly. He systematically attacked the view that medicine had become more humane with time. He conceded that, of course, we have better drugs and treatments now, but he believed that in the 18th century, the professional doctor was born and that he was a sinister figure who would look at the patient always with what Foucault called the medical gaze, denoting a dehumanizing attitude that looked at a patient just as a set of organs, not a person. One was, under the medical gaze, merely a malfunctioning kidney or liver, not a person to be considered as a whole entity. Next in Foucault's oeuvre came Discipline and Punish. Here, Foucault did his standard thing on state punishment. Again, the normal view is that the prison and punishing systems of the modern world are so much more humane than they were in the days when people just used to be hung in public squares. Not so, argued Foucault. The problem, he said, is that power now looks kind, but isn't, whereas in the past it clearly wasn't kind, and therefore could encourage open rebellion and protest. Foucault noted that in the past, an execution, a convict's body, could become a focus of sympathy and admiration, and the executioner, rather than the convict, could become the locus of shame. Also, public executions often led to riots in support of the prisoner. But with the invention of the modern prison system, everything happened in private behind locked gates. One could no longer see and therefore resist state power. That's what made the modern system of punishment so barbaric and properly primitive in Foucault's eyes. Foucault's last work was the multi-volume History of Sexuality. The maneuvers he performed in relation to sex are again very familiar. Foucault rebelled against the view that we're all now deeply liberated and at ease with sex. He argued that since the 18th century, we have relentlessly medicalized sex, handing it over to professional sex researchers and scientists. We live in an age of what Foucault called scientia sexualis, science of sexuality. But Foucault looked back with considerable nostalgia to the cultures of Rome, China, and Japan, where he detected the rule of what he called an ars erotica, erotic art, where the whole focus was on how to increase the pleasure of sex rather than merely understand and label it. Once again, modernity was blamed for pretending there'd been progress when there was in fact just a loss of spontaneity and imagination. Foucault wrote the last volume of this work while dying of AIDS that he had contracted in a San Francisco gay bar. He died in 1984, age 58. Foucault's lasting contribution is to the way we look at history. There are lots of things in the modern world that we're constantly being told are fantastic and were apparently very bad in the past. For example, education or the media or our communication systems. Foucault encourages us to break away from our optimistic smugness about now and to go back and see in history many ways of doing things which were perhaps superior. Foucault wasn't trying to get us to be nostalgic. He wanted us to pick up some lessons of way back in order to improve how we live now. Academic historians have tended to hate Foucault's work. They think it inaccurate and keep pointing out things he hadn't quite understood in some document or other. But Foucault didn't care for total historical accuracy. History for him was just a storehouse of good ideas, and he wanted to raid it rather than keep it pristine and untouched. We should use Foucault as an inspiration to look at the dominant ideas and institutions of our times, and to question them by looking at their histories and evolutions. Foucault did something remarkable. He made history life-enhancing and philosophically rich again. He can be an inspiring figure for our own projects.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. You probably know a bit more about Foucault than you hope to. Now, Foucault, he was concerned a lot with power, and his view of power was a little different than, is standard. We think of certain social institutions as being the locus of power, like the federal government, for instance, with their means of the technology of violence that they possess. But for Foucault, power was everywhere and nowhere. It was dispersed throughout the web of social relations. So if you wanted to revolt against the way things were, there was really no one place to focus your anger and your rage. It was spread throughout the system. He felt the way to resist the power of these discursive formations, or the disciplinary apparatus, he sometimes called it, was to seek and engage in what he called peak experiences, which, HCC certainly does not endorse that notion, and I do not, but Foucault would have urged people to basically give yourself over to what used to be called sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Just go to extremes. And as you see, he did walk his talk, so to speak. He died of AIDS that he contracted during a period of his life when he was pushing the limit, taking a lot of drugs and having a lot of casual sex with primarily men, I believe, in circumstances that before AIDS was identified as a unique disease and the cause was unknown. So anyway, moving on. Okay, as I mentioned, deviance it's constructed, socially constructed. People decide what it is, usually the powerful. It can be reconstructed, it can be modified. For instance, smoking tobacco, that's really taboo now in many ways. You can be looked down upon if you smoke cigarettes. There are still some populations where a lot of people smoke, specific demographics, but in the from the era, early part of the 20th century, women who were fighting for the right to vote, for instance, the suffragettes, they often smoked. They viewed it as a male privilege that they were going to claim as well. During the 1960s, before it was widely known that cigarettes were bad for you and the tobacco companies were testifying before Congress and lying about what they knew about what it was doing to bodies, it was considered fashionable or cool to be a smoker. That's something that teenagers would do to rebel against parental authority. Often the parents smoked, though, as well. It was quite common in that era, and I don't know when it changed. You used to be able to, cigarettes were advertised on television, and they were made to appear glamorous of sorts. I well remember when the first cigarette specifically marketed for women was advertised, and they linked it with the with women's struggle for equality with men, for the right to vote and other rights. So anyway, so and another example of that is marijuana. Now that you're smoking as well, I'm sure there are venues where and households where you could freely smoke marijuana, but if you lit a cigarette, you would be shunned. You would be asked to leave. Uh, the room reserved for marijuana smoke only. So smokers are now somewhat deviant. Marijuana initially, the government didn't pay much attention to it until the 1920s. There are various ideas for why it became criminalized. One that I tend to favor is that it could be grown anywhere, and it was a drug used by the poor rather than alcohol. Alcohol was taxed. Alcohol provided revenue to the state, small state, as in Texas or Massachusetts, and the larger state. There were federal taxes on it. So they were not happy with people shifting to some sort of intoxicant that you could easily grow yourself anywhere that was escaping the revenue stream. So this is out of date right now. It's from 2016. States where there's medical use only and those where recreational use is allowed. We're now California and Nevada both allow recreational use. I don't know about Arizona. Colorado as well. I believe they have even, they flirted with, and it may just have been the city of Denver, legalizing hallucinogenic mushrooms. But Missouri, my home state, recently legalized medical use of marijuana, but I know that doesn't mean that physicians are going to approve of that. My sister lives in Missouri and has MS, and she's had to sign statements saying she understands that if they find out she is trying to get permission to use medical marijuana, they will cut her off of treatment. So she's moving to another state. Why does someone become a deviant or a criminal? Well, Italian I think he was a psychologist, but I'm not going to swear to it. Cesare Lombroso in the 19th century, he claimed that criminals were biologically defective in some way, and he used the skull shape as proof. He did an extensive study of comparisons of bumps and knots on the skull, something called phrenology, which had been around for some time, being able to the belief that you could understand something about a person's personality by the shape of their skull. It was a fad for a while, but it was a pseudoscience. Later, some other psychologists said people with a certain body type, a mesomorph, were more likely to commit crimes. And there's been some research that attempts to link certain genes with a predisposition towards committing criminal acts. There is another set of strictly psychological theories. For instance, some people are, in the view of some psychologists, merely psychopaths. They have these traits, or a psychopath is a name for someone that has a certain set of traits which they believe are linked to a predisposition towards criminal behavior. Some of these traits are the individual who's withdrawn, emotionless, and enjoys depiction of violence might be a psychopath. And psychopaths are more likely to commit more extreme, serious crimes that injure other people's bodies. However, these psychological theories can't explain why someone, why these loners and people who are members of a gang where you are tightly bound into a sort of a community, why they're both criminals. So sociological theories are probably more reliable, and they emphasize how the definition of crime depends upon the social institutions, varies in time and space. So you should have come across these theory groups in chapter 1, and I did a brief lecture about some of them. Structural functionalist theory, they tend to have an absolutist perspective. Some acts are absolutely deviant. How do you know they're absolutely deviant? Well, because they violate so many of the legal and social codes in so many societies. That's a bit of circular reasoning. You see that a lot with structural functionalists, but August or Emile Durkheim and Robert Merton are a couple that have some structural functionalists that advance theories of crime and deviance. Durkheim wrote about something called anomie, which is normlessness that's translation. But this is a situation that arises when standards of behavior are vague and in flux, and it's a characteristic of more advanced social systems with a complex division of labor, where the social change is occurring very rapidly. People can't get their moorings, and that makes them more apt to commit acts which are unacceptable. Durkheim also said that crime was inevitable and served a positive social function insofar as the rituals of punishment, like all rituals, when people are focused on the same thing, tend to bind them together and increase their sense of solidarity. It also just reinforces the rules. So deviance has Merton, Robert Merton, a 20th century functionalist, developed a theory of deviance as an adaptation to some sort of imbalance, a dysfunction in an individual's relationship with social systems. And that deviance can, in a way, provide, some sorts of deviance provide an outlet for behavior that might threaten other institutions. Merton's theory was called strain theory. Get to that in a moment. Conflict theory is the social power perspective. That's like Howard Becker's claim earlier that those with the most power create these rules. Several other theorists that are more Marxist in thinking. Richard Quinning was one, and one thing, they believe that crimes are basically economic in nature, and they result from the inequalities of the capitalist system, and you can kind of transcode all criminals. You can consider all criminals political prisoners in a sense if you take it to the end of the line of thinking, so to speak. Symbolic interactionists, they're more relativists. It just sort of depends. They've developed theories called labeling theory and have studied, Becker is one of them, the process by which someone becomes deviant. A famous article he wrote was called Becoming a Marijuana Smoker, where he described how you had to learn how to experience the drug. And you learn this from other individuals. And because you're doing something illegal with a small group, that kind of binds you to that group in a sense. You begin to identify yourself as a marijuana smoker. That's part of your identity. Okay, so there's some more information about structural functional theories of deviance. Let's move on to, here's Merton's theory of anomie or deviance, a strain caused by a discrepancy between the approved goals of society and the approved means to achieve them. I had to memorize this multiple times as an undergraduate. You don't have to. So if you accept the means to a goal and you accept the goals, that is considered conformity. You're going after what society says is important, and you're doing it the way they want you to do it. Well, if you accept the goal, but you reject the means, you're an innovator. If you reject the goal, but you accept the means, that's ritualism. Retreatism, you're rejecting both. What's an example? Okay, let's say as it still is the case, there's society puts a value on getting a college education. So you accept that, and so you eagerly apply to colleges and apply yourself to your studies. That's conformity. Let's say your parents want you to go, you don't really want to go, but you go anyway. So you're accepting the means, but well, you are rejecting the goal, but you're accepting the means to that goal, which is attending classes. That's ritualistic behavior. You're going through the motions. Innovation, you're accepting a goal that you need some sort of advanced education, but you reject the means. Perhaps you get into some other sort of training program, or you just take a long break from college and learn on your own for a while. Let's say, and if you reject both, you don't go to college and you don't study. Rebellion kind of is off to the edge. You can create new goals and new means. Here you might put the commune movement of the late 1960s and early 70s. People leaving mainstream society, forming communities where land was held in common. Perhaps children were, cared for by a rotating series of mothers. In some radical cases, even wives and husbands might have been held in common. So kind of the open marriages, so to speak. For some reason, I'm blanking on the term for that now, but I'll remember by the end of the lecture. So social disorganization theory is another group. Culture deviance theory is another. Cultural, so conflict theories, social power perspective. You may read through a few of those. I see no reason to go through them all. They do, however, have to use the social constructionist ideas and symbolic interactionist ideas to explain how these rules have developed and how a person may, in some cases, adopt a deviant lifestyle. But they see it as a process of struggle between dominant and subordinate classes over control of symbolic resources, the norms, rules, and laws. Those are part of the symbolic structure of cultures. Labeling theory is, Howard Becker was closely related to that, and a man named David Matza. You become deviant when you're successfully labeled by a social control agent. These agencies can be the police, courts, welfare workers, doctors, counselors. They're rule enforcers, but the rule creators are usually the elites with more power. You also have a group of people called moral entrepreneurs. They create campaigns to create or increase the sanctions on something that they disapprove of, some behavior they think should be criminal or at least strongly discouraged. And there will be a campaign. The prohibition movement in the United States, when alcohol was prohibited from around the year 1919 until 1932 or 33, I believe, is an example of that. Alcohol was made illegal, but it was still consumed, imported, made in many cases in bathtubs. There was an element of what one calls xenophobia, fear of the other, because immigration was picking up from Southern Europe, where drinking with your meals was just part of your way of life. And at the same time, that immigration was being limited to people from Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, for instance. The prohibition movement gained steam. A moral panic is a public concern and arousal, sort of hysteria over something. Now, I can't think of a good example of that now. They tend to come and go. It may be in this era of social media, it's hard to sneak one past, but I recall, the last one I can recall is there was a circuit of women and ministers who would who would go to different churches and describe how they had been made breeders for satanic cults. They were captured by a group of Satanists and held captive and impregnated, and their babies were taken and used and murdered in satanic rituals. Well, it turned out this was all bogus. It relied upon something called recovered memories, where a psychotherapist of sorts would more or less coach someone to remember something that had happened to them that they had repressed. Well, there are all manner of abuses that can be attached to that. I'm not saying the notion of bringing repressed memories out is totally fraudulent, but it certainly has questionable applications. Stigma, degradation ceremonies, and social control. Irving Goffman, an important sociologist, he wrote a book called Stigma, which is a characteristic others define and describe as deviant. Discredited stigmas are the differences that are readily apparent. Discreditable are differences that would get you labeled as a deviant if people knew about it. So, many aspects of drug use and abuse would fit into that, and sexual differences from the heteronormativity that characterizes our society, or has for so long. Harold Garfinkel wrote, among other things, about something called a degradation ceremony, where you go into it as one thing and you come out of it as another. Criminal trials, you go in, you're presumed innocent till found guilty. You go in innocent, you come out as a felon, and suddenly your life is going to be completely different from that point forward. Garfinkel called them a sort of secular communion. A communion that would be when people in a religious group would share something or engage in some behavior which made someone a member of that group. So you're losing one social identity and getting another one. R.D. Lang, who I've already mentioned, thought psychiatric examinations were a type of degradation ceremony, because if others find out you've been seeing a psychiatrist, suddenly you're going to have a different identity, whether you want it or not. And even these days, when treatment for depression is so common and sometimes even sought, when Prozac was first around, Prozac's an antidepressant that increases the level of serotonin in the intersynaptic cleft of your brain. There were cover stories in news magazines about that, and some people claiming that they were not depressed, but taking it improved their mental functioning. So people were going to their doctor asking for it who were not depressed. However, in general, you don't really want others to know that you are getting any kind of treatment for what is considered a mental disorder, because despite how much we've progressed, and despite how progressive you may think your friends and family are, they probably aren't. So this is still a real thing. Lang was right. Social control theory developed by Travis Hirschai. I'm sure that's in the textbook. And here's a table summarizing all of them. Mental illness. I think I'll save this, if at all, for health and medicine, but when I took deviant behavior, the focus of after spending half the semester on theories, we spent the latter half of the semester discussing drugs, suicide, and mental illness. So, but here is, you can see the difference between the two models of mental disorders. The medical model is essentialist. What that means is there's something essentially different about that person, biologically different. Sociologists see it as constructed by others. It's a constructionist point of view. And you can read through the other differences if you like. Crime, violation of these important norms that have been put in legal codes, in the bodies of law, and enacted by legislatures, become laws. The criminal justice system is a web of other subsystems that enforce the legal code, evaluate the offenders, punish the offenders, provide social services to people after they've left prison and while they're in prison. In addition to defense attorneys, psychiatrists, bail bond agencies, they're all involved in this entire corrections industry. So the prison system is a key element of that. And part of that has become even more privatized than it had been 100 years ago. We now have a lot of private prisons. I'll mention that in a moment. Here's just some general terms that you will come across. Parole, you're released early from prison. Probation, you don't go to prison, but a probation officer keeps you on a short leash, so to speak. You must report to them and follow certain guidelines or risk having your probation turned into a sentence of confinement. Recidivism is the tendency to commit another crime after you've been released from prison or from probation. These two types of deterrence are just something from the sociology text. How do we know how much crime there is? Well, the official sources for crime in the United States are of two broad types. They encompass crimes that are formally reported and crimes that are discovered through surveys of people in the world, random surveys. So the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, publishes the Uniform Crime Report annually, but they only cover the rates of 7 or 8, I haven't counted them here, used to be 7, what are called index crimes. They consider the most serious. Here's the list: murder, robbery, rape, aggravated assault, burglary, theft. I think it's over a certain value to make you're not going to be in the UCR for shoplifting a package of gum. Motor vehicle theft and arson, setting fire to a structure or a business or something. There are also, as I mentioned, there are surveys. The National Crime Victimization Survey is the best known. They've been conducting it since '73. And what they find is the actual crime rate is higher than the rate suggested by UCR. Why? Because many crimes aren't reported, particularly sexual assault, or they're not detected. If you take a box of paper clips from your office home and use them, technically that is a crime, but nobody's ever going to know it. So demographics, generally younger men commit crimes. People often join gangs in their youth. If they are ever going to join a gang, it's done early, but they may retain that identity. There are different sorts of gangs with different kinds of social structures and activities. Many of them do commit crimes, sometimes in an organized manner, sometimes opportunistic, street gangs, but some of them are involved in dealing drugs. There are also organized criminal gangs like the Bandidos, a motorcycle club that engages in contract assassination, drug trafficking, and human trafficking. And there, it's fixed now. Okay, Bandidos, they formed here in the Houston area, in San Leon, a group of Vietnam veterans who worked on the ports and were basically angry about the fact that they'd been forced to go to Vietnam and the way they felt they had been treated upon their return. They organized themselves to live outside the law. So they are still around right now. They're global in scope. Okay, as I said, most crimes are committed by men. African Americans disproportionately, according to these statistics, commit more violent crime. That means they commit more than their numbers would indicate, but still only just about a third of all violent crimes. That leaves 2/3 for others. So I, frankly, I really avoid the subject of crime and crime statistics because it can give the wrong impression, because sometimes the balance of things is not clear and considered. Okay, those in the upper classes, and we're generally talking about people that look like me, for instance, that are Caucasian, often males. Um, Somebody called pale males recently on a listserv I get through my membership in an American Sociological Association group. Uh, they're more likely to commit crime, really, and they are more likely to avoid detection. Actually, I shouldn't say they're more likely to commit crime. They're more likely to get away with it than those in the lower classes, because they know how these systems operate. They know how to disguise it. White collar crime is what we're talking about there, the affluent crime that occurs, and this is our textbook defines it, crimes committed by respectable citizens in the course of their work, which is different than most of these other crimes they talk about are predatory crimes. Somebody is taking advantage of some specific individual, often causing them harm. So in the case of white collar crime, this may be committed by owners and managers of large corporations, chemical companies, for instance. Um, the Arkema chemical company in the Houston area, allegedly, according to former employees, they took advantage of Hurricane Harvey to illegally discharge waste products into the San Jacinto River, which ended up in the Gulf. That's a white collar crime. Uh, Simply violating environmental regulations by a corporation can be a white collar crime. Um, Often they're treated very generously by the regulatory authorities, particularly in Texas. The affluent tend to face more lenient treatment than the poor, who may commit crimes that cost society much less money. One of the most infamous damaging cases for people around the country of white collar crime took place, or at least it was centralized right here in Houston. It's also at the time the largest corporate bankruptcy ever. A company called Enron that was involved in a number of things. It was hard to tell exactly what they were up to, especially from their commercials, but they were considered the most respected corporation in the country at one point. Several of their chief executives went to jail. Jeffrey Skilling, whose photo I may have just moved right past in the beginning. Can't have that. Let's go back to this. Right there, Jeff Skilling. Yes, I did talk about him. So he got out in 2018. I'm going to attach a brief document about Enron right after this, the PDF of this lecture, if you're curious about that. Furthermore, if you are curious about it, there's an excellent documentary called The Smartest Guys in the Room. It appears sometimes on Netflix and Amazon Prime. I don't see it there now. You can rent it for $3 or $4. If you want to rent it and write a paper about it of at least 2 pages, that can be worth 100 points. You will enjoy the film. It's an excellent documentary. And when you see the building, you're going to recognize it if you've been downtown much. It's still downtown. I believe the county owns it now. So another aspect of crime that I already alluded to is the disproportionate number of African Americans that are arrested, convicted, and incarcerated. Michelle Alexander wrote a book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. She is interviewed in the film 13th, which is another film you can take a look at and write a paper about if you like, for extra credit if you need it, or you just want to replace some other assignments with it. So the new Jim Crow. Well, what was the old Jim Crow? That was a system of legalized discrimination that was found throughout the southern states up until beginning in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, when schools began to be desegregated. But African Americans were legally deprived of access to the same things that white Americans could enjoy in the South. And the civil rights movement, the classical civil rights movement, was a struggle against the many faces of Jim Crow in the South. So one aspect of Jim Crow was the difficulty it created for voting for African Americans. You might have to pay a poll tax or take a test to get a voter ID card. This test might be something like you had to be able to name all of the county clerks in every county in the state of Alabama at the time you were applying for you were registering to vote. That's difficult. Not a lot of people would vote today if everyone had to pass such a test. Well, so you might wonder, there were many poor white sharecroppers in the South who did not have much education but were voting. How did they pass this test? Well, these rules came with a provision called a grandfather clause. If your grandfather had the right to vote, then you did not have to take the test. You were simply registered. So going back to the end of slavery and the Reconstruction era in 1865 and going forward, Jim Crow came into effect 1880-ish. Your grandfather if you were African American, it was almost certain your grandfather was a slave and could not vote, was not even accepted as a citizen. So that prevented, it gave the poor, uneducated whites the ability to vote, really, while preventing others. So the war on drugs that began in the late 80s and into the 90s and has continued was focused on communities of color. And the sentences for possession of drugs were made much tougher. The mandatory minimum sentences became common, where even if before a judge might have been able to take some circumstances into account in deciding what the proper punishment should be, that right was taken away from the judges. If you were found guilty of being in possession of crack cocaine, for instance, the law specified what penalty must be given to you. And because enforcement was focused on communities of color, even though most drug users are white, a lot of African Americans and Latinos went to prison. There was a boom in the building of prisons because they had to make more room for more prisoners. You began to see private prisons where a corporation would build prisons and get a contract from a county government or even a state government to house prisoners, a certain number of prisoners for a certain amount of money. It's not uncommon to find that a judge that is sentencing people to a private prison owns stock in the company that owns the private prison. A bit of a conflict of interest. So Michelle Alexander pointed out that often if you're a convicted felon in most states, you cannot vote, at least not right away after you're released from prison. So your right to vote has been taken away, something your grandfather had and had struggled with civil rights. Many people lost their lives and were injured and suffered abuse during the civil rights movement to gain the right to vote for all African Americans. And as a result of the war on drugs and mass incarceration it led to, many African Americans are disfranchised. They lose the right to vote. There are other consequences of being a convicted felon that make it less likely that you can find a decent job, and make it perhaps more likely you're going to go back to some criminal activities in order to support yourself. Some sorts of parole requirements in some cities might say you cannot go to a certain part of town after 10 o'clock at night, or you cannot be out after a certain time of day. So you are very strictly controlled, and this affects African Americans and Latinx people disproportionately. So in her view, the war on drugs was just a strategy of control of African Americans and to reassert and maintain white dominance in an era which was, by popular acclaim, colorblind after the election of Barack Obama to the presidency. Some statistics about crime, or about incarceration, really. So the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, but a quarter of the people that are in prisons are in the United States. Prison industrial complex, in addition to there being private prisons and money-making operations for people who invest in them, there's also, we see spreading more and more often, the prisoners have to work while they are there for very low wages. They're working to produce items which are put out for sale on a market and compete with similar items produced by people that are not in prison. So price-wise, they cannot compete. There have even been cases where prisoners were staffing credit card call centers. And as you probably know, that doesn't sound like a good idea. Probably that. I mean, I would not. I don't want to make any claims about any particular person in prison, but I know there's probably at least one who would know how to what things they could do with credit card numbers and birth dates and social security numbers that other people might be less inclined to do. So the crime rate seems to be related to economic conditions. It began to go down in the U.S. in the 1990s. Things were rather prosperous. The economy was growing. The federal budget was even balanced briefly by President Clinton. Reached a 40-year low in 2008. The United States has a higher rate of violent crime than any other industrialized nation, which that means most of Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Mexico, I believe as well. I don't know. I think Mexico is considered in this category of industrialized nation. Violence, I'm not going to say much about that, just some things I've come across recently. For a long time, people thought that the violence was part of our nature. I was taught in anthropology that every human being has an innate ability to kill another human being in self-defense if it's necessary, and that may be so. But perhaps people knew how to avoid these circumstances long, long ago. At least that's the claim made by a Dutch historian, Rutger Bregman, whose book Humankind I've recently been reading. So it's almost had been universally accepted based upon findings of anthropologists and archaeologists that humans have been violent since the beginnings. They would find skulls of 30, 40,000 years old that appear to have damage showing that they had been hit with a heavy object. There had been some sort of a murder or a war. A famous philosopher of the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes, used that assumption that in this state of nature, there was just nothing but anarchy. Everyone was at war all the time. People didn't live that long, and that's why we gave our rights away to something called a government to rule us in exchange for protection. Bregman argues there's really no evidence. This evidence was exaggerated. That human groups were murdering each other, engaging in warfare before the advent of civilization, which occurred during the Neolithic Revolution, roughly 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. Large cities began to develop, writing systems developed. People began, rather than living by hunting animals and gathering nuts and berries, began to plant seeds in the ground and grow crops, more crops than the society needed, community needed, which he, a surplus, in other words, which was taken over by some elite and distributed to their followers. And as a reward, he cited a case from, it's been, I'm not sure who wrote about this, I didn't check the footnote, but during the Second World War, some Americans went to a remote Pacific island of Efalik and showed them some films of World War II activity just to explain to them what they were doing there. And the people were very disturbed. They were you know, it was like showing something horrible to a child. And later, another anthropologist went back there to talk to them, and he wanted to know if there were really people in America that had killed another person. It was inconceivable to them that anyone would do this. So they had been kind of left off the grid and had never picked up this tendency to kill others. So some other things, which is neither here nor there, I'll throw in there. James Scott has written a book about this transition from being hunter-gatherers roaming around in small bands to living in cities and villages and growing crops. He doesn't believe people freely agreed to do that. He thinks they were captured as slaves in some sort of war and they were forced to work the fields for others, for elites that controlled some soldiers and a small group of priests and other artisans that were in their orbit. And he cites archaeological evidence of that. Also points out that your diet would have been better if you are eating the things you can find in the forest. You would have a much more diverse diet than you would if you're just eating wheat or barley or something like that. He's able to cite evidence of how tall people were from skeletal remains. People were taller as hunter-gatherers. They got shorter when they were working the fields, and height is an indicator of nutrition in many ways. Not always, of course, but if you're looking at the same group, you tend to see during long periods of famine and malnutrition, people end up growing to they're shorter than people that came before or after. It's just a fact. No criticism intended of short people. All right, there's some other words you can look at if you need them. Okay, so that is that. I shall post that shortly. There's my stop share here.